The sun was barely rising over the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as passengers bustled through the gate, eager to board their morning flight to San Francisco. Among the travelers was the Miller family. David, a composed man in his early 40s dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer and khakis, his wife Angela, graceful in a soft cream-wrap dress, and their energetic 5-year-old son, Caleb, who clutched a toy airplane that lit up when he spun its propeller. As they stepped into the aircraft's first-class cabin, David guided his family toward their assigned seats in the second row. The plush leather seats gleamed under the cabin lights, and the space smelled faintly of citrus and leather polish. Angela helped Caleb into his seat by the window and handed him a small juice box she had tucked into her purse. Caleb beamed with delight as he made his toy plane take off across the armrest. Nearby passengers offered polite smiles and nods, nothing more, nothing less. But not everyone was as welcoming. At the far end of the cabin, Heather Collins, a senior flight attendant with over a decade of experience, noticed the family. Her professional smile faltered ever so slightly as her gaze lingered. Something in her demeanor shifted, her eyes tightened, and she adjusted her name tag as if bracing for confrontation. With clipboard in hand and a rehearsed smile, she made her way toward the Millers. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped yet civil. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" David looked up, his face calm, though his eyes hinted at quiet surprise. "Of course," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his blazer and handing over the documents. Heather studied the passes longer than necessary, her brow furrowing as if something didn't add up. "First class?" she asked, her voice edged with doubt. David nodded. "Yes, that's right." Heather hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "I'll need to check something with the gate agents. Please remain seated." As she turned and walked briskly toward the galley, Angela leaned in, her voice low. "What was that about?" "Not sure," David replied, glancing at Caleb, who was still happily playing. "Maybe just a routine check." But both he and Angela felt it, the tension in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. They had traveled often and knew the difference between protocol and presumption. And this didn't feel like protocol. What Heather didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that David Miller wasn't just any first-class passenger. He was someone with far more influence than he let on. And by questioning his right to be there, she was about to set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the cabin walls. Just minutes after taking their seats, the Miller family's peaceful start to the flight took a sudden turn. David had just finished storing their carry-ons in the overhead bin, and Angela was gently reminding Caleb to buckle his seatbelt when Heather Collins, the flight attendant, returned to their row, this time with a more assertive posture and tighter expression. "I'm sorry," she said curtly, barely making eye contact. "There appears to be an error with your booking. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so we can sort this out." David paused, his eyes narrowing slightly though his voice remained even. "What kind of error?" Heather glanced around, clearly aware that other passengers were now listening. "It's likely just a system issue," she replied quickly. "If you'll follow me to the galley, we can clear this up." Angela frowned, clutching Caleb's small hand. "Is there a problem with our seats?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. "No, ma'am," Heather said with a strained smile. "I just need to confirm some things. It won't take long." David gave Angela a quiet nod. "Stay here with Caleb. I'll take care of it." He stood, buttoning his blazer with practiced calm, and followed Heather toward the front of the plane. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice while others stared openly. A gentleman in his 60s across the aisle leaned toward Angela and whispered, "Everything all right?" She managed a small smile. "Just a mix-up, I think." but it was clear that no one else had been asked to verify anything. Only them. Meanwhile, in the galley, Heather pulled out a phone and called down to the gate. Her voice was hushed but urgent. "Hi, I need to confirm the booking for a David Miller and family, 3 first-class tickets." A brief pause followed. The response from the ground crew was clear, confirmed and fully paid. "No issues on our end." Heather hung up, lips pursed. Despite having confirmation, she didn't return with an apology. Instead, she hardened her tone and stepped back toward David. "Sir, I'm going to need you and your family to move to the main cabin while we finish sorting this out," she said flatly. David blinked slowly. "You've already confirmed the tickets, haven't you?" Heather stiffened. "It's airline policy. I need to follow protocol." David's tone grew firm. "And what protocol is that, exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you're making decisions based on assumptions, not facts." Heather stood silent for a moment, caught off guard by his calm challenge. Back in first class, Angela watched the galley curtain with increasing unease. Caleb, now restless, looked up at her and asked quietly, "Mommy, why is Daddy taking so long?" She smiled down at him, though her heart was pounding. "Daddy's just fixing something, sweetheart." But deep down, she knew this wasn't a simple error. Something unfair, even ugly, was unfolding. And it wasn't over yet. Standing in a narrow galley, just feet from the cockpit, David Miller remained composed. The murmur of passengers from first class echoed faintly behind him, but his attention was squarely on Heather Collins, the flight attendant now fumbling with excuses. "Mr. Miller," she said, arms crossed tightly, "this isn't about the cost of your tickets. It's just, we have to be sure people in first class meet certain standards. It's a premium cabin." David tilted his head slightly, his voice low but clear. "Are you implying that I don't meet those standards?" Heather looked momentarily rattled. "No. I mean, of course not. It's just protocol." There it was again, protocol. A word often used to mask deeper issues. David had heard it before, in boardrooms and social clubs, always wrapped around uncomfortable truths no one wanted to say out loud. Taking a deep breath, David pulled his phone from his blazer pocket and calmly dialed a number. His voice shifted, cool, authoritative. "Yes, it's me. Go ahead. Now's the time." He ended the call and turned back to Heather. "I'd like to return to my family." Heather hesitated. Something in his tone, in his posture, unsettled her. But she stepped aside, letting him walk past her and back toward first class. As David rejoined Angela and Caleb, whispers rippled across the cabin. He sat down, gave Angela a small, reassuring nod, and gently patted Caleb's hand. His expression was calm, but Angela knew that behind that quiet smile, wheels were turning. Moments later, a chime sounded over the intercom. The captain's voice filled the cabin with steady authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated while we complete a few final adjustments. Your comfort is our priority." Unbeknownst to the passengers, that announcement had followed a phone call to the cockpit from the airline's executive team, alerted by none other than David Miller himself. Back in the galley, Heather's phone buzzed. She picked it up with a shaky hand. "This is Heather." It was the captain. His tone was clipped. "Miss Collins, I just received a call from the board. One of our first-class passengers, Mr. David Miller, is a principal shareholder of this airline. You need to be extremely careful how you proceed." Heather's face turned pale. She felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Stumbling over her words, she whispered, understood. With that, she slowly made her way back to first class, heart pounding. Passengers looked up as she approached, but none more directly than David. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice now lacking the firmness it once had, "I'd like to apologize. It appears there was a misunderstanding." Angela's expression turned cold. "Now it's a misunderstanding?" David didn't respond right away. He simply leaned back, his voice calm and measured. "We'll remain here for now. But I'll be speaking to your superiors. Personally." Heather swallowed hard. In that moment, she finally understood this wasn't just a passenger she had misjudged. This was a man who helped write the rules she thought she was enforcing. And now, the rules were about to change. As Heather Collins turned away from the Millers, visibly rattled, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted. A quiet murmur began to spread like a ripple across calm water. People had seen enough to realize something wasn't right. One man, seated in 3A, leaned toward his wife. "That family had valid tickets, didn't they?" he whispered. His wife, a retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes, nodded. "Sure looked like it to me. And they've been nothing but polite." From across the aisle, a younger businessman, mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, spoke up just loud enough for others to hear. "I don't know what that flight attendant is thinking, but it's pretty obvious she singled them out." The energy in the cabin changed from quiet curiosity to simmering disapproval. Heads turned. Expressions stiffened. And though no one stood up, the collective mood was clear: the Millers weren't alone. Back in the galley, Rachel Thompson, a younger flight attendant with barely 3 years of experience, caught Heather's eye as she returned to the prep area. "What's going on?" Rachel asked in a low voice, handing Heather a tray of bottled water. Heather avoided her gaze. "Just handling a seating issue." "It's complicated." Rachel frowned. "Is it really, though? Their tickets checked out. You said so yourself earlier." Heather stiffened. "It's protocol." Rachel's voice dropped, laced with quiet frustration. "Protocol doesn't mean profiling, Heather." Heather didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. Just then, the galley phone rang again. Heather answered it reluctantly. The voice on the other end was the captain, and this time he wasn't as diplomatic. "Miss Collins, the executive team has confirmed Mr. Miller's status with the company. He's not just a shareholder, he's one of the airline's primary owners. This needs to be corrected, immediately. Do you understand?" Heather's knees felt weak. "Yes, sir." As she hung up, Rachel crossed her arms. "So, what now?" "I have to bring them back," Heather said flatly. "You should have never made them leave," Rachel replied without missing a beat. When Heather returned to the main cabin to retrieve the Millers, the tension was palpable. David sat upright, calmly typing on his phone, while Angela kept a steady arm around Caleb, who was now quietly drawing airplanes on the back of a napkin. "Mr. Miller," Heather began, her voice more humble now, "we'd like to return your family to your original seats. I'll personally ensure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Now that you know who he is." David stood, gathering Caleb's toy and adjusting his blazer. "We'll go back," he said simply, "but this isn't over." As they walked through the aisles, several passengers nodded in quiet solidarity. One elderly man even gave a respectful nod. David returned it with a small, dignified smile. And as they settled into their first-class seats once more, it was clear the cabin had taken notice, and so had the airline. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight settled into cruising altitude, but Heather Collins couldn't relax. Every glance from a passenger felt like judgment. Every whispered comment between rows carried the weight of what she'd done. Her hands trembled slightly as she rearranged the drink cart, her once confident stride now replaced by hesitation. In the galley, Rachel Thompson silently passed her a stack of service napkins but didn't say a word. Heather knew she'd lost something far more important than a moment of authority. She had lost respect. Then the galley phone rang again, piercing the silence. "This is Heather," she answered, her voice tight. It was the captain. His tone had shifted completely. "Miss Collins, I've just received another update from the executive office. Mr. David Miller's legal team is monitoring the situation in real time. You're to remain on board after we land. Security will be waiting at the gate. You'll be asked to give a full statement." Heather's heart sank. "Yes, Captain," she whispered. The flight dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. At one point, Heather passed the Millers in first class. David sat quietly, eyes focused out the window. Angela sipped a cup of chamomile tea, her expression unreadable. Caleb was sound asleep, his toy airplane still clutched tightly in his hand. Heather approached hesitantly. "Mr. Miller, I just want to say, I'm truly sorry." David didn't look at her. "Save it," he said quietly. "The people waiting for you at the gate will hear what you have to say." Back at the galley, Heather leaned against the counter, breathing heavily. Rachel finally broke the silence. "I warned you," she said gently. "You can't treat people like that and think it'll disappear." Heather rubbed her temples. "I didn't know who he was." Rachel shook her head. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect." As the plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport, the tension among the crew was thick. Passengers began collecting their belongings, and the first-class cabin stirred to life. But the Millers remained seated, they weren't in a rush. Near the door, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane. One spoke firmly. "Miss Collins, we need you to remain on board for questioning." Passengers turned, watching in silence as Heather nodded and stepped aside, her shoulders slumped. She felt exposed, small, and deeply ashamed. Out in the terminal, the Millers were greeted not by baggage handlers, but by 2 airline executives in tailored suits. The vice president of operations extended his hand, face flushed with regret. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, we deeply apologize for what happened. We are taking this matter extremely seriously." David accepted the handshake, his voice calm but cutting. "Good. Because I intend to hold every person and every policy accountable." And with that, the Millers walked forward, not just toward baggage claim, but toward the beginning of something far bigger than a single flight. That evening, after returning home to their quiet neighborhood in the suburbs just outside San Francisco, David Miller sat at the desk in his study, the glow from his laptop reflecting off his glasses. Angela had just tucked Caleb into bed, the little boy still clutching his toy airplane, blissfully unaware of the storm his family had weathered earlier that day. But David wasn't finished, not even close. On his screen, a draft email was already in progress. The subject line read, "Immediate action required, Flight 237 discrimination incident." David's fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, his tone measured but unyielding. "To the CEO and board of directors. The treatment my family and I received on Flight 237 was not only unacceptable, it was reflective of a deeper, systemic problem within your organization. As a principal shareholder, I am formally requesting a full investigation and immediate reform. This is not a suggestion, it is an expectation." He paused briefly, then continued typing. This includes the following: mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all flight and ground staff. Implementation of an independent third-party oversight committee. Monthly progress reports submitted to the board on inclusivity metrics. A public apology not only to my family, but to every passenger who has experienced similar treatment while flying your airline. He reread the message, adjusted the language for clarity, then hit send. The sound of the whooshing email echoed like a small cannon shot in the stillness of the room. Angela entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of herbal tea. "Is that what I think it is?" David nodded. "Step 1. She set the mug down beside him. "Do you think they'll listen?" "They won't have a choice," he replied. "This isn't just a PR problem, it's a liability. A culture problem. And I won't allow it to be swept under the rug." Angela sat beside him, folding her hands. "It's not just about us, is it?" David shook his head. "There are people out there who go through this every day, people who don't have the platform or the influence to push back. If I don't speak up, I'm just as guilty as the ones who stay silent." Angela reached for his hand. "Then let's make sure they change, for good." Across town, at the airline's corporate headquarters, the executive team was already in damage control mode. News of the incident had gone viral, with hashtags like #FlyFair and #AccountabilityMatters trending online. Calls were coming in from media outlets, shareholders, and advocacy groups. The CEO, Robert Langston, stared at David's email on his screen, reading every word carefully. His jaw tightened. "This isn't going away," he muttered to his assistant. And he was right. For David Miller, this wasn't about revenge, it was about change. Real, measurable, long overdue change. By morning, the airline would have no choice but to respond. And this time, window dressing wouldn't be enough. By sunrise the next morning, the story of what happened to David Miller and his family on Flight 237 had made its way into headlines nationwide. From morning talk shows to online news outlets, the incident had sparked widespread outrage, especially among frequent flyers and longtime airline customers. The conversation wasn't just about one man's experience, it had become a national dialogue about fairness, dignity, and the consequences of unchecked bias. At the airline's headquarters in Chicago, the pressure mounted quickly. The board of directors had convened an emergency meeting. The public relations team was swamped, fielding calls from reporters and loyal customers demanding accountability. And the company's stock had already taken a noticeable dip, small, but enough to rattle investors. In the center of it all stood Robert Langston, the airline's CEO. A man in his early 60s, with a no-nonsense demeanor shaped by decades in corporate America, Langston wasn't easily shaken, but this was different. "I've just read Mr. Miller's email 3 times, he said to his executive team. "He's not asking for headlines, he's asking for real change. And frankly, he's right." Langston took a deep breath and then made the call. "Draft the apology. And I want it public before noon." By 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time, the airline's official statement was live on their website and across all major news outlets. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 237 involving Mr. David Miller and his family. This experience does not reflect the values we claim to uphold. Effective immediately, we are launching a company-wide reform initiative. This includes mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees, new oversight procedures involving third-party reviews, and an internal audit of our customer service practices. We offer our sincerest apology to the Miller family, and to any customer who has ever felt disrespected while flying with us." The message was signed by Robert Langston himself. Back in the Millers' home, David sat at the kitchen table, reading the statement aloud while Angela poured a fresh pot of coffee. "It's a strong start," she said, sliding a plate of toast across the table. David nodded, though his face remained serious. "Words are only as good as the action that follows. We'll see." Caleb ran into the room, holding his toy airplane in one hand and wearing his superhero pajamas. "Are people still talking about the plane, Daddy?" David scooped him up and smiled gently. "Yes, son, but this time, they're talking about how we can make things better." Angela looked at them both and said quietly, "If we did all this just to make sure the next family doesn't go through what we did, then it was worth it." The statement may have calmed the public for the moment, but David knew the real test would come in the weeks ahead. Promises were easy. Proof was what mattered. And he intended to hold them to every word. 1 month later, the Miller family boarded another flight, this time from San Francisco to New York for a family visit. As they stepped into the first-class cabin, there were no awkward glances, no second looks, no questions about their seats. The crew greeted them with warm smiles and offered assistance in a way that felt genuine, not rehearsed. David helped Caleb into his window seat, while Angela settled in beside them, her calm presence grounding the moment. The air was different now, not just in the cabin, but throughout the airline. Since the incident, the company had followed through on its promises. Over 80% of the staff had completed new bias and inclusion training, third-party audits were underway, and a new customer feedback system had launched, allowing travelers to report concerns directly and anonymously. David, ever observant, noticed small changes that spoke volumes. The diversity in the crew. The tone of the announcements. Even the in-flight magazine featured an article about equity in travel, a clear sign the airline was paying attention. As the plane taxied down the runway, Caleb turned to his father, clutching his toy airplane as he always did. "Daddy," he said with wide eyes, "are people being nicer on planes now?" David smiled, brushing his son's curls back gently. "I think they're learning, buddy. And that's a good start." At home in their suburban neighborhood, the Millers' story had inspired others. Friends, neighbors, even people they barely knew, reached out to share their own experiences or simply to say thank you for speaking up. The story wasn't just about injustice anymore, it had become a symbol of the change that was possible when people with influence chose to act. One evening, while David reviewed another progress report from the airline's executive team, Angela brought him a cup of peppermint tea. She sat beside him on the couch, watching as his expression shifted from cautious to satisfied. "They're doing it," she said quietly. David nodded. "They are. And not just for us, for every family that ever felt small in a place where they should have been treated with dignity." Angela leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll always have to fight these battles?" "Maybe not always," David replied, his voice thoughtful. "But for now, we fight so the next generation doesn't have to." Outside the living room window, the lights of the neighborhood twinkled in the evening calm. Caleb was upstairs, fast asleep, his toy airplane on the nightstand beside him. Back in the airline's boardroom, David's presence continued to be felt. His voice wasn't just that of a shareholder, it was that of a father, a husband, and a man who refused to accept business as usual. And though the road ahead would require vigilance, the Miller family had lit a spark that wouldn't easily burn out. Not just change for a company, but for an entire culture. Because in the end, respect shouldn't have to be earned, it should be guaranteed. The story of the Miller family reminds us that dignity and respect are not privileges, they are rights. No matter our background, appearance, or social standing, every person deserves to be treated with fairness. For those of us who've lived long enough to see the world change, we know that progress often comes slowly, and only when someone is willing to speak up. David Miller didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate with anger. Instead, he led with calm conviction and used his position not for revenge, but for reform. That's a powerful reminder. True strength often shows itself in restraint, and real change begins with integrity. For many older adults, this story resonates deeply. We've witnessed decades of injustice, but we've also seen what can happen when people choose to act with courage and wisdom. Whether you're a grandparent teaching a child about fairness or a community member standing up for others, your voice still matters. Your experiences still count. In the end, the lesson is simple: never underestimate the impact of one person who insists on doing what's right, not just for themselves, but for everyone.